to do today. Of course, it being Father's Day, and happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. The obvious one was talking about, God the Father, and then of course the earthly fathers and how they compare and how they differ and what the good and bad and both of them can be. And I did my studying and taking my notes for 2 or 3 days, and I had several pages worth of notes. And I thought, hey, this is gonna be a great sermon. And then, like He does with me several times over the past years, God said, nope, that ain't gonna work. So instead, what we're gonna do today, there's something that even she doesn't know about, is we're gonna kind of use my own personal story of things and how, she's over here already. Get this woman a Kleenex. Of how my own dad and how God and stuff, how they've influenced me and continue to influence me even at my ripe old age, and how that kind of differs a little bit. When I was growing up, like everybody else, I went to Sunday school and church, and I, learned all about God and Jesus and then the Trinity and everything like that. Right from wrong, because if you did wrong, you'd get your hind end whooped. But that's kind of what the parents taught you, was what's right and what's wrong, and you either did wrong, you either did right, or you got punished. And that's kind of, my dad kind of helped that, and he kind of taught me the value of hard work and good behavior and being good morals and everything like that. So sometimes we kind of had to do the harder stuff we wanted to do, even if the conditions weren't ideal. You had to go out there and the cold and the wet and whatever, just because that was what you had to do, because you had to take care of the family. He taught me how to change the oil in my car, taught me how to change the tire, and a bunch of other stuff as far as what you had to do to take care of things, because that's what dads do. And of course, now, as I get older, I just call the local service station and said, hey, I need my oil changed, or call AAA and say, hey, I got a flat tire, but I just don't know how to do it. Growing up, there's always those struggles that kids have that dads help them deal with, getting picked on and stuff like that, and getting bullied or getting fights and what have you. Of course, there's always when I was growing up, there was always the dreaded detention or getting the paddle from the teacher, and then going home, and then mom and dad find out you got in trouble and get into trouble again. That was always fun. And that kind of reminds me of what we see in Proverbs in chapter 13, the ever popular verse 24, that talks about disciplining your children and how you discipline them in order to correct that behavior and make them better people. But if you don't, you end up encouraging that bad behavior. You end up not teaching them those consequences of right from wrong. Now, growing up, of course, like I said, I misbehaved in school and I misbehaved at home and got in trouble from both. The point of that is that even our bad behavior, dads are there to go ahead and guide us on how we're supposed to behave and not behave. And they teach us this in order so we'd be a lot more successful in life. And how we learned that bad behavior as we grow older can give us a lot more serious consequences. Unfortunately, like most kids, I tested my dad's patience and those boundaries quite often, and learned quite often that testing those boundaries and their patience would get me in trouble. But, my life growing up wasn't all about getting in trouble. Dad teach me, excuse my wife, did teach me a lot of good lessons in life. Like I said, he taught me what the importance of hard work was and how important that was. And there were a lot of times, whether at the time I regretted it and hated it because it was cold and miserable, but he taught us that value of hard work and taking care of the family when we'd go out in the cold and the snow and help cut wood to keep heat in the house. And oddly enough, I'd cut wood for a half hour, I'd be cold and miserable after 5 minutes, but then we'd get done and I'd go outside for 3 hours getting cold and wet and playing in the snow and everything, and love every minute of it. So, it's that mindset the kids have where they love to play, but they hate to work, even if it's the same temperature. But then, like I said, he taught me that value of hard work and what the importance of that is. And, even today, I, get out there when it's cold and wet and rainy, whatever, because that's what you have to do. Whether it be cutting wood or picking up those spare corn cobs from the cornfields after harvest and grind them up for feed for the chickens. I did it all. But then again, after that, he took us fishing and camping and hiking and all that other fun stuff. So it wasn't all bad with Dad, and that's the kind of stuff that I still do today, getting outside and enjoying the fresh air. But as I said earlier, getting back to Sundays and going to church, and I did go to church and I go to Sunday school, and I'm sure that influence, that church influence and the biblical influence and that impact did probably had a bigger impact than I realized on my life, but it wasn't until I was a lot older and wiser that I was able to fully understand exactly how much that influence is and how to fully appreciate that a lot more, and how even when we sit in the front row drawing on a piece of paper, we're still be able to get some kind of influence from what's being said by those big people up front. But as I got older, like I said, I continued to struggle with being picked on and the acceptance of others. And since I wasn't the smartest, the most athletic, or anything like that, of course, that led to all sorts of problems, being picked on or picked last or bullied and everything else that I had to deal with when I was growing up. And that led to all sorts of problems and issues, of course, and that's probably why I'm a lot more of an introvert now than I could have been if I was a lot more athletic and outgoing growing up. But, like I said, the sacrifices of Mom and Dad, showing me why you sacrifice and how you have to sacrifice for your families, did have a big influence on me. And, of course, I continue to sacrifice to help care for my family in my own little way. Now for the fun part. Graduating high school and going off on your own. Now is where the real trouble starts. Of course, after high school, I wasn't the most studious type, so of course I didn't feel like going to college. And getting a job just didn't seem like the right kind of thing for me when I graduated high school. So I did like any other smart kid would do when he has no brains, and he signed on the dotted line and said, "Okay, Uncle Sam, I'm yours." Well, that made things even worse, because it led me down that path of all sorts of sin and fun and dirt and sinful temptations and everything like that influenced the next 20-some years of my adult life. And I'm not going to go into too many details and all that right now, but let's just say that instead of filling my body and my mind up with those biblical influences that I had when I was growing up, I filled them full of all sorts of nicotine and alcohol and other sorts of sinful vices and addictions that influence people these days. And like I said, it got me very good at not only learning how to do the things that were bad in my life, but it got me very good at knowing how to lie, to hide all that. And not only hide all of that, but it also helped to feed that addiction of being able to blame all those bad things on everybody else. It wasn't my fault that I was too busy drinking. It was his fault because he's the one that drove, or he's the one that made me mad, so I had to do something to calm down, so I had to have a cigarette and a beer. No, I'm the one that picked it up. Well, after I got out of the 3 years in the Army, I decided, okay, well, now it's time to do the smart thing and decided to go to college a little bit and do that. Well, I signed up and went to Votech and went to junior college and got my degree. And I don't know how I did, because I was still so busy drinking and smoking and partying and skipping half my classes. I'm not even sure how I got the grades that I did end up failing out of college. I didn't find out until many years later that the C's and D's I thought I got were actually A's, B's, and C's. So I was pretty surprised by that. And when I finally found that out, I definitely thought, thank God for him looking out for me as our Heavenly Father, a lot more than I probably thought that he did at the time. Of course, like I said, my eyes were not quite open as they are now. Now, God didn't stop having the influences on my life, even when I didn't see it. I was very good at playing the game, and like I said, I was very good at lying to myself and to others, and so like everybody else, I still continued to play the game of going to church and being the good, studious Christian that I was supposed to be, living off prim and proper as far as what everybody else seen. At the time, this was when I was out at Concordia, and they were doing a Teens for Christ thing about once a month. And so I went to that more for the enjoyment of the program than for anything else. But God still had his hand in that. And one night I thought, okay, well, I'm a good Christian. I'm going to go up and I'm going to lead somebody in the sinner's prayer. No. I got led in the sinner's prayer that night. But the only problem was that I didn't have anyone there to tell me what I needed to do next. I had nobody there to mentor me, to say, okay, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do next. This is where we need to go next. Without that influence, without that mentoring, I didn't change. I continued to lie to myself and to others and say, hey, I'm still the dutiful Christian, but I still drink, I still smoke, I still do all those other things that I should be doing, and I'm not going to mention here in church. I was continuing to lie to myself and to others. Well, then came the very fateful day where the pastor of the church that I was going to at the time called me and my first wife into his office with a couple of the other members of the board of the church at the time and said, we're sorry, you're no longer welcome here. Well, I thought, what did I do? I didn't do nothing wrong. Like I said, I was still lying to myself and everybody else. And so I said, okay, fine. At the time, I was that typical mad, hateful, vengeful, selfish person. So I said, okay, fine. You don't want me here. I don't want to be here either. And I said, okay, if that's what God's like, I don't want him either. And so I left the church, and for the next 10 years or so, I did not step foot in a church unless it was for a wedding or a funeral. But that didn't mean that God wasn't still there. I just didn't see him. I didn't want to open my eyes and see the influence that he still had in my life, because he was still influencing me. He was still there for me like a father should be. I just didn't know it. Now, during that 10 years, of course, God had a lot of lessons to teach me, just like I always like to reference the book of Job and all the turmoil that he went through. The only problem was I was one of Job's friends. I was the one that was telling Job, hey, no, you're stupid for sticking with him. You're an idiot for sticking with him, for not disavowing God because of everything he's putting you through. That was me, not Job. And during that 10 years, I went through 2 failed marriages. I lost a lot of just stuff that I'd kept from my childhood. And of course, when that come, I did just like I thought it would. I blamed everybody else for it. It was not my fault that I was too stupid and selfish and self-centered and didn't pay bills like I was supposed to. It was their fault for not telling me that I need to come pick my stuff up. It wasn't mine. It was their fault. And like I said, I was so full of selfishness and self-centeredness. I didn't care about anyone or anything else but myself and what I needed. And that reminded me, I was going through this, that kind of reminded me of the story of the prodigal son in the Gospels. I knew what I wanted. I knew I wanted it now, and I was going to take it. And I was going to go off. I was going to do this big, wonderful, had this big, wonderful life. And the same thing happened. I went broke. I was almost homeless a couple of times. Struggled to figure out where I was going to eat. I got so low down that I even went so far as to stealing from people that I had no business. Well, of course, you have no business stealing from anyone, but I didn't care. They had what I wanted, so I took it. Money, food, didn't matter. They had it, I wanted it. That's how far down I went. Even spending a few days in jail for my own selfish stupidity didn't do me any good. I still didn't care. I was still that selfish, self-centered, egotistical, full of myself, idiot that I'd been for so many years. I did not care. But what I didn't see, like I said, was that God was right there, waiting for me to open my heart, open my eyes, and see that He has a straighter, better path for each and every one of us. There's that old saying that the Lord works in mysterious ways. And He was just getting ready to start revealing the mysteries of that path to me in ways that I could never even believed. She's over here laughing because she knows what's coming next. That involves her. Now, by this time, I was in the height of adult dating sites and chat sites and everything else, and I was being deep in my sin and selfishness. I was all over these chat sites and dating sites, and of course, being the cheap guy I didn't want to pay for anything, so I would do what I can to send messages and chat on these dating sites without having to pay any money. Why am I going to pay my money to somebody else? They don't deserve it. But as luck would have it, oddly enough, God actually had His hand in this too. He was leading me to where He wanted me to be. And so one night I was checking these dating sites to see if I'd gotten any messages from somebody else that I could use and abuse and throw off to the wayside when I was done with them. And someone messaged me and said, "Hi." Okay, hi, how are you? Who are you? What do you want? But it kept going. We kept talking. We kept chatting, getting to know each other, and I was having fun. It was nothing more fun. I didn't care. But she decided to say, "Hey, I'm going to go off and visit my parents, but this is a rural area and they don't have a lot of money, so they just have that dial-up internet. So if you don't hear from me, it's just because they're too busy on the phone talking to everybody else, so I can't talk to you that much." And yeah, I'm talking about this one sitting over here that I brought with me today. And so we decided and so I was like, "Okay, well, where are you going?" "Well, you wouldn't know it. It's a small town north of Manhattan called Waterville." "Really?" "Well, if you see my parents, let them know I said hi." Well, as luck would have it, her granddad and my dad actually had coffee at the cafe every morning, and so it's like, okay, here's this is definitely God working in this, and I don't even know it. You know what I'm saying? And so that kind of opened things up even more. And so we started actually talking in person and getting to know each other. And oddly enough, someone a little over a decade younger than me actually liked some old cantankerous, self-centered goofball like me. I still haven't figured that one out. If anybody has the answer for that one, let me know. We'll talk after church. But we got to talking. We got to, neither one of us, to be totally honest, neither one of us were exactly the good, upstanding, righteous Christians that we should be. And so we did like any other person would be. We went out and we hung out and had a few beers and had a few drinks and did things that we weren't supposed to do, but God was working in that. And one day, she talks to me on the phone. She says, I get this program that I go to. You don't have to. She knew that I didn't like going to church. She was like, she knew that I was basically that one where if you step foot in church, you're going to be caught on fire because hellfire and brimstone's going to come coming down on top of you. Which is, try it once. See what you think. You don't like it, you don't have to go again. Okay, I want to keep using you as much as I can, so I'll go ahead and go and try it out and just, fake it a little bit and lie to everybody and make it seem like I want to be there. And so I did. I sat all the way in the back, darkest corner of the room that I could possibly sit. Didn't say no more than hi, and that was it. But God had his hand in that. He had his way of opening things up to me that I wasn't even expecting. Because these people didn't care if I drank, smoked, cussed, kicked the dog, kicked the can, whatever. They didn't care. They accepted me for me. Just like I've preached here or in other places several times, they met me where I was at. They met me in the muck and the mud and the garbage that I was at and I made for my life, and they met me right there. They said, "Hey, how you doing? How you doing? What's going on? What's going on in your life? How you doing?" And I'm like, okay, who are these weird people? What do they want? But I kept going back, and I kept going back. And eventually God softened my heart enough to where I shocked the heck out of her. And I says, "Hey, let's go to church." I think it took her about 5 minutes to pick her jaw up off before when I said that, but I went to church, and that's how it all started. But God had his hand in that. Just like our earthly fathers tend to influence us hopefully for a lot longer than after we turn 18, God the Father wants to be our influence as well. He wants to be there to show us where that path in our life is going to be. And even if we don't get that influence from our earthly fathers, or even if, I know there are some that are listening to this or will be listening to this that don't have that earthly father influence. A lot of us have, for whatever reason. God is still there to influence us. God is still there to say, "Hey, I don't care." God is still there to meet us where we are at, take our hand, and lead us back to that path where he wants us to. Kind of reminds me of a couple of verses that I've seen. Everybody knows what 23rd Psalm says that David wrote. And in verse 4 it says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And then in Matthew 22, Christ gives us this part of the great commandment. The second one being, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And what these two have in common, oddly enough, they don't sound like they do, but what they do is they tell us that no matter where we are at, God will be there with us. And to add to that, Christ is saying, meet people where they're at. Don't say, "Hey, come to this church because this is better." You're not good enough because you don't believe in God like I do. You're not good enough because you're not a Republican. You're not good enough because you're not a Lutheran. Don't care. God doesn't care. God doesn't look at what we are. God looks at where we are and wants to take us away from that. Christ's sacrifice on the cross washed all that sin and dark and yuck away. God doesn't see that anymore. He wants to guide us and bring us onto that path for a closer relationship with him. And just like our earthly Father and our Heavenly Father want us to live as good a life as possible, the only difference is where our earthly Father is preparing us for life as an adulthood. Yuck. I'm still waiting to grow up. I don't know if I went there or not. But God is preparing us for even something even greater. He's preparing us for a life in eternity with Him. I don't know, that sounds like it'd be kind of cool. What do you think? Think that's a good idea? She's ignoring me. That's okay. No. Like I said, I spent the first 20 years of my adult life running as far as I could away from anything and everything that led me to that path that God wanted in my life. And when I returned to that path, I found a lot more than I expected to find, including this goofball over here that for some reason still sticks with me after all these years. Anybody have any idea why? I don't know, let me know. But I also found that life that God wants us all to have, that life filled with grace, forgiveness, and a success that we may not even realize we're capable of having. And it's that grace and forgiveness that allowed me to have and to get the education that I got that ultimately led me to being where I'm at today and being right here in front of you. But we want to remember that our earthly Father wants to protect us from having to worry about all the bad things in life, but God is just well, not just the opposite, but approaches it a little bit differently. Because He knows that tough times are what's going to bring us the strength that we need. But He's going to walk through that with us. He's going to be there to guide us through that. The Apostle Paul stated in one of the verses that I wrote that I like as well is in 1 Corinthians 10:13, where it says, "No temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man." Because remember, Christ went through all that stuff that we went through and then some. So He knows what we went through. He goes on to say, "God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, He'll also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it." He knows, when He's talked about your ability, He knows what you're capable of doing more than you are. He knows what you go through a lot greater than we do ourselves. So just because you're going through things that you may think or you're never going to be able to make it through it, this is more than you could ever be able to handle. God knows better. He knows what you're capable of. He knows what you can handle, and He will give you a way through it and a way to escape it. Now, closing in another verse that I want to bring up is one that I brought up quite often and said that it's one of the verses that I really enjoy and really influences my life quite a bit, and that's in Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah writes in chapter 40, verse 31, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." And before we go eat bacon with Maggie, I want to leave you with this one final thought. When we rely on God and wait for His timing and His leading in what we do in life, while it doesn't guarantee us a life without trouble, it does promise us that no matter what, God is always with us. And He will always help us find a way out of whatever trouble and turmoil we find ourselves in. We just have to be patient and wait. Now we're going to sing or we're going to eat bacon? Lisa says let's sing some more, then have more bacon. Thank you.